The courtroom was dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. A 12-year-old black boy stood at the defendant's table, his small hands gripping the edge, his voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're my mom." The pen slipped from Judge Rebecca Hart's fingers, hitting the desk with a sharp click. Her face went pale. For the first time in her career, she looked completely caught off guard. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Whispers spread like wildfire. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. The bailiff exchanged a stunned glance with the clerk. Rebecca swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "What did you just say?" Jaden met her gaze, eyes glossy with unshed tears. "You're my mom." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Could it be true? Or was this just a desperate lie? What do you think? Is this boy really her son? Drop your thoughts in the comments and follow to see what happens next. The small courtroom hummed with quiet tension. It wasn't the kind of case that usually drew a crowd, just another juvenile hearing, another kid in trouble. But today, something felt different. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, lawyers exchanged curious glances, and whispers rippled through the gallery. At the defendant's table sat Jaden Williams, a 12-year-old boy, small for his age. His hoodie hung loosely over his thin frame, the faded fabric stretched at the cuffs. His sneakers were scuffed, soles worn from too many restless steps on too many streets. He sat stiffly, hands curled into fists in his lap, his fingers twitching, as if holding on to something invisible. But it wasn't the charges against him that made him nervous. He slowly lifted his gaze to the bench, where Judge Rebecca Hart adjusted her robe and flipped through the case file. She was a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, a firm hand in a courtroom that saw too many troubled kids pass through its doors. A judge who prided herself on being fair but tough. Yet, as Jaden stared at her, something inside him twisted. A strange pull, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. His heartbeat stuttered. He knew her. He didn't know how or why. But something deep in his bones told him this wasn't the first time he had seen that face. A shiver ran through him as Judge Hart finally looked up, her sharp gaze scanning the courtroom before landing on him. For a split second, her expression flickered. Just a small shift, barely noticeable. But Jaden saw it. A hesitation. A crack in the cold, professional mask. And suddenly, he wasn't just a scared kid sitting in a courtroom anymore. He was a boy staring into the face of a woman who should have been a stranger, but wasn't. The prosecutor cleared his throat and stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced motion. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, as if this case was already decided. "Your Honor, the facts are simple," he began. The defendant, Jaden Williams, was found trespassing in a private, gated community. He had no business being there. A concerned resident spotted him loitering near her property, and when she attempted to question him, he ran. That alone raises suspicion. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Jaden kept his eyes down, his small fingers gripping the fabric of his hoodie. He had heard these words before. Loitering. Suspicious. Out of place. Words adults used when they didn't want to say what they really meant. He hadn't broken in anywhere. He hadn't stolen anything. He had simply been there. Wrong place, wrong time. But that didn't matter. To the woman who had called the police, he was a stranger in a neighborhood where people like him didn't belong. She hadn't asked why he was there. She hadn't spoken to him at all. She had just seen him. And that was enough. Jaden sat motionless at the defendant's table, his fingers digging into his sleeves. He wanted to speak, to explain, but he knew it wouldn't matter. It never did. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his notes. When confronted, the defendant chose to run rather than comply with law enforcement. That, Your Honor, suggests guilt. Jaden's stomach twisted. That wasn't what happened. He hadn't been sneaking around. He hadn't been looking for trouble. He had been helping. The cat had been stuck between the iron bars of a front gate, its tiny body wedged too tight to escape. It meowed frantically, its fur bristling in fear. Jaden had crouched down, whispering soft reassurances, trying to ease it free without hurting it. That's when he heard the voice. Sharp. Accusatory. "What are you doing here?" Jaden had barely turned around before he saw the woman, a tall, well-dressed lady standing a few feet away, phone already in her hand. She didn't wait for an answer. She didn't ask if he needed help. She just saw him. Jaden had felt the panic rising in his chest, the same way it always did when adults looked at him like that, like a problem, a threat, a mistake that needed to be corrected. So he ran, and that was all it took. A boy running in the wrong neighborhood wasn't just a scared kid. He was a suspect, an intruder, someone who needed to be stopped. Now, sitting in that cold courtroom, Jaden wanted to scream that it wasn't fair, that he had only wanted to help. But fairness wasn't something kids like him could count on, because no one cared why he ran. They only cared that he did. Jaden sat still, his breathing shallow, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. Fear gripped him, but there was something else now, something creeping in beneath the panic, unsettling in a way he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the weight of the courtroom pressing down on him. It wasn't just the way the prosecutor's words twisted the truth, turning him into someone he wasn't. It was her. The woman sitting high above him in her black robe, her expression unreadable, her presence commanding. Judge Rebecca Hart. Jaden had never seen her before. He was sure of that. But somehow, deep inside, something stirred. A flicker of familiarity. A pull he couldn't explain. For a second, he forgot about the charges against him. Forgot about the glares from the jury. Forgot about the whispers in the crowd. All he could focus on was her face. And the uneasy feeling that this wasn't the first time he had looked into those eyes. Judge Hart flipped through the case file, her expression as composed as ever. Then she spoke. "Mr. Williams, you will have your chance to respond, but for now, remain seated." The sound of her voice cut through the air. Firm, steady, the kind of voice meant to command a room. Jaden's body tensed. A shiver ran down his spine, cold and unexpected. That voice, his fingers twitched against the wooden table. His breath caught in his throat. He had heard it before. Not here. Not in this courtroom. Not in any place he could recall. But somewhere. The timbre, the cadence, the way the words fell, something about it felt familiar. Too familiar. His heartbeat quickened. His mind scrambled to place it, to make sense of the unease curling in his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper. Recognition. Jaden's hands clenched into fists on his lap. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the voices around him. His gaze stayed locked on Judge Hart, studying every detail. The sharp arch of her brows, the way her mouth pressed into a firm line, the piercing focus in her eyes. And then, a memory surfaced. A dimly lit room. His foster mother's drawer, left slightly open. The edge of an old photograph peeking out beneath stacks of paperwork. He wasn't supposed to look. He knew that. But curiosity had won. He had pulled it out carefully, his small fingers tracing the faded edges. It was a woman. Young, serious, standing stiffly in front of a plain backdrop. There was something distant in her eyes, like she was trying to hide a part of herself even from the camera. Jaden had stared at that picture for a long time, wondering who she was, wondering why his foster mother had hidden it. Now, in this courtroom, facing a woman he had never met. Or had he? His breath hitched, his stomach twisted. The woman in the photograph. She looked just like Judge Hart. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. "You're my mom." For a split second, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. No movement, no breath. The rustling of papers, the faint scratching of pens, all of it stopped. A reporter, mid-sentence, let his pen slip from his fingers, a faint clatter breaking the silence. Another, her eyes wide, stared at Jaden as if she had misheard. Gasps rippled through the room. A juror blinked in disbelief. The bailiff, usually stoic, shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening on his belt. No one spoke. No one knew what to do with the words that had just shattered the trial's controlled rhythm. A boy, a defendant, had just claimed the presiding judge was his mother. And for the first time that morning, the trial was no longer about a simple trespassing charge. It was about something far bigger. Something no one had seen coming. Judge Rebecca Hart sat frozen. The courtroom's murmur swelled around her, a distant hum she barely registered. Her fingers, still curled around the pen, suddenly felt weak. Before she could stop herself, it slipped from her grasp, hitting the desk with a sharp clink. She didn't move to pick it up. Her face, always composed, always unreadable, went pale. The tight control she prided herself on, the unwavering authority, the air of detachment, fractured in an instant. This was absurd. Impossible. And yet her body betrayed her. A tremor ran through her hand as she pressed her palm against the table, as if grounding herself against the weight of the boy's words. She should have shut it down immediately, dismissed it, regained control. But she couldn't, because deep in the pit of her stomach, beneath the logic, beneath the impossibility of it all, something felt off. Not in the way of a courtroom disruption, not in the way of a child clinging to a desperate lie, but in a way that made her afraid to look at him again. Rebecca forced herself to look at him, not as a judge, not as the authority in the room, but as a woman suddenly standing at the edge of a past she had locked away. Her eyes met Jaden's, and for the first time that morning, she truly saw him. The curve of his face, the deep brown of his eyes, the way his chin trembled slightly, the same way hers once did when she was younger, when the world felt too big and too cruel. Something inside her lurched. No, this was a mistake, a trick of the mind, a coincidence at best. And yet, she couldn't look away. She had spent years perfecting the art of emotional distance, detached, rational, unshaken. It was how she survived in this job. It was how she survived, period. But now, sitting in that chair, with the boy staring at her like she was someone more than just a judge, she felt the foundation beneath her cracking. Not because of his words, but because something inside her whispered, "What if he's right?" Rebecca barely registered the murmurs as she left the courtroom. The heavy door to her chambers clicked shut behind her, sealing her off from the chaos outside. But inside, her own mind was just as loud. Her breath came in quick, shallow bursts. Her hands, steady in the face of countless trials, now trembled as she reached for the filing cabinet in the corner. This is ridiculous. The thought barely had time to settle before she yanked the drawer open. Her fingers hovered over the folders, hesitating for just a moment. She could stop now, shut the drawer, walk away. But deep down, she already knew it was too late. Her hand found it. A thin, worn folder, no label, just a faint crease down the middle, as if it had been handled too many times by hands that once hesitated, just like hers did now. Rebecca swallowed hard and pulled it out, laying it flat on the desk. Her fingers hesitated again at the edge of the cover. Once she opened this, there would be no going back. With a sharp inhale, she flipped it open. Her eyes swept across the pages. Then she froze. The name, the date, the details she had been told all those years ago. They didn't match. Her breath caught. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer. For years, she had believed what they told her, that it was over, that the past was behind her. But staring at the papers in front of her now, she realized she had never known the real story. Rebecca's pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the pages, her vision blurring for a moment before snapping into focus. Jaden Williams. The name was right there, his birth date, his placement in the foster system. But something was wrong. Her eyes darted across the document, searching for confirmation of what she already feared. Mother's name, she exhaled sharply. It wasn't hers. The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest. Jaden wasn't her son. The boy standing in that courtroom, the boy who had looked at her with something raw and aching in his eyes, wasn't hers. The relief she expected never came. Instead, something far worse took its place. Because if he wasn't her son, why did she still feel like she knew him? Rebecca gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, and a dull ringing filled her ears. She forced herself to turn the page, fingers trembling over the fragile paper. Then she saw it. Another name, another child. Her chest tightened. The air in the room suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. Her eyes locked onto two words printed in stark black ink. Infant deceased. Her vision blurred. The room around her faded, swallowed by a memory she had spent a lifetime trying to bury. A hospital room. Cold, sterile. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. She had been 18. Too young. Too scared. Her hands had clutched the stiff white sheets, her body weak, her mind racing. She had asked, begged to see her baby. Just once. But the answer had been firm. It's better this way. The words had come from a woman in a crisp uniform, her expression unreadable, her touch clinical as she patted Rebecca's shoulder. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. He's gone now. Let him go. Rebecca had believed them. She had forced herself to believe them. It was the only way she had survived. But now, staring at the document in front of her, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. If it had all been the truth, if her baby had really died, Why was there another file? Why was there another name? A cold, terrible thought took root, curling deep in her gut. What if it had all been a lie? Rebecca's breath came in shallow bursts as she flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling over each brittle edge. The words blurred for a moment, as if her mind refused to process them. But then, one line cut through the haze like a blade. Adoption placement finalized. Her grip on the folder tightened. The room around her seemed to tilt. No, that couldn't be right. Her child had died. That was what they told her. That was what she had been forced to accept. But now, the truth sat in front of her, undeniable. Her baby hadn't died, he had been taken. Her pulse pounded in her ears as her eyes darted across the document, searching for something, anything that could disprove what she already knew deep down. The dates, they didn't match. The signatures, not hers. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through her as realization took hold. They had lied. Her parents, the doctors, the people she had trusted. They hadn't just convinced her to let go. They had made the decision for her. They had signed the papers, arranged everything, handed her baby over to strangers while she lay there, weak, broken, believing he was gone. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling with the weight of it all. For years she had carried a grief so deep, so absolute that she had never thought to question it. But now, staring at these pages, this carefully orchestrated betrayal, there was no denying it. Her child had lived. And now, all these years later, he was standing in her courtroom. Rebecca's hands trembled as she traced the name on the paper, her pulse hammering in her ears. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, suffocating. Jaden Williams. She whispered the name in her mind, over and over, as if saying it enough times would make it less impossible. But the facts stared back at her, unmoving. Her child had lived, and he had been given a different name, a different life, a life without her. Her breath hitched as she flipped to another page, her gaze locking onto a small, grainy photograph attached to the records. A boy, maybe 5 or 6, staring back at the camera with wide, uncertain eyes. The same eyes that had looked up at her from the defendant's table. Her throat closed. The air in the room felt too thick to breathe. Jaden wasn't just some lost boy caught in an unjust system. He wasn't just another case. He was her son. The boy she had been told was gone. The boy she had mourned. The boy they had stolen from her. And today, fate had brought him back to her. Rebecca stood frozen in her chambers, the truth unraveling before her like a cruel trick of fate. The room felt suffocating, closing in around her. But beyond the walls, out there in that courtroom, sat a boy who had spent his entire life searching for something he never knew he'd find. Her son. She wasn't ready. How could she be? How did she even begin to explain the years that had been stolen from them? But she couldn't stay hidden. With a deep, unsteady breath, she straightened her robe and forced herself to move. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last, but she pushed through, her trembling fingers wrapping around the handle before she turned it and stepped back into the courtroom. The room was still. All eyes turned to her. But she didn't care. Her gaze found Jaden immediately. He sat at the defendant's table, small and silent, his hands curled into fists in his lap. He wasn't looking at anyone, not the lawyers, not the judge's bench, not even the reporters who had been scribbling furiously just moments ago. He was staring at the wood grain on the table in front of him, as if he could disappear into it. Rebecca swallowed hard, forcing herself to step forward. "Jaden?" she said, her voice softer than it had ever been in that courtroom. Slowly, he lifted his head. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then she did something she had never done in all her years as a judge. She stepped down from the bench. With each step toward him, the gap between them felt wider, not smaller. She had spent her life believing in control, in order, in reason. But none of that mattered now. She stopped just a few feet away. The weight of the moment sat between them, heavy and unspoken. He blinked up at her, his eyes searching hers, looking for something, anything that made sense. And then, his voice broke the silence, soft but raw. "Do you regret it?" Rebecca felt the words hit her like a blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Regret. It was such a simple word, and yet she had spent a lifetime avoiding it. But she couldn't avoid it now. Not here. Not with him. Rebecca felt something inside her crack, something she had held together for years with sheer force of will. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of restraint, of keeping emotions buried beneath the weight of logic and duty. She had presided over countless trials, handed down sentences without flinching, held her ground against the most hardened criminals. But now, standing in front of this boy, her son, she felt powerless. His question lingered in the air between them. Do you regret it? The answer should have been simple. Yes, no, something definitive. But nothing about this was simple. Her throat tightened as she looked at him, truly looked at him. The curve of his face, the way his lips pressed together, holding back emotions he wasn't ready to show. The silent plea in his eyes, the need to know if he had ever mattered to her at all. Her vision blurred. A single tear broke free, slipping down her cheek. She let it fall. Then, with a voice that barely belonged to her, she whispered, I don't know what to say. Her breath wavered. But if you give me a chance, I won't walk away from you again. She had spent so many years pretending the past was dead. Now, for the first time, she was choosing to face it. Jaden didn't move at first. He just sat there, staring at her, his mind an unsteady swirl of emotions too big for him to name. For years, he had wondered about her, imagined her face, thought about what he would say if he ever found her. But none of his daydreams had looked like this. He had expected anger, maybe denial. A cold dismissal that would confirm everything he had feared, that she had forgotten him, that she had never wanted him in the first place. Instead, she stood before him crying. It was just one tear, maybe two, but it was more than enough, because it meant she felt it too, the loss, the weight of everything stolen from them. He wanted to speak, to ask the questions that had burned inside him for as long as he could remember. Why didn't you look for me? Did you ever wonder where I was? Did you ever miss me? But his throat felt too tight, like the words would shatter if he tried to say them out loud. So he just sat there, trying to understand what this feeling was. It wasn't closure. It wasn't relief. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it wasn't anger either. For the first time since stepping into this courtroom, he didn't feel alone. His fingers curled slightly against his lap. He looked at her, this woman who was supposed to be a stranger, but somehow wasn't, and searched her face one last time. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. And that had to mean something. Slowly, cautiously, he gave the smallest of nods. Not an answer, not a resolution, but a beginning. Outside the courtroom, the world kept moving. The gavel had fallen, the case had ended, and yet, for Jaden and Rebecca, it was only the beginning. There were no easy answers, no perfect resolutions. A single conversation couldn't mend years of separation, couldn't rewrite the past. But maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. It wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time. Time to learn, to heal, to understand what they had lost and what they could still build. Jaden wasn't sure what came next. Neither was Rebecca. But for the first time, they were both willing to try. What about you? If you were Jaden, would you be ready to forgive? If you were Rebecca, how would you make things right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to follow for more.